Happy Sunday evening, everyone. Again, I'm sorry we weren't able to meet tonight. Kelly is feeling a little bit better, but she just wasn't up to having company. So we'll meet next Sunday night at the same time. What I want to do is just go over a few things that we were going to discuss tonight. Maybe you could spend some time this week in Mark thinking about what I'm about to show you, and it will help deepen your understanding of Mark's story. Really, what I want to do on the Sunday nights that we meet is simply read Mark. But more than that, I want to introduce you to some of the motifs or the devices that Mark will use to deepen his story, or at least deepen the way he tells the story. And by recognizing some of these devices, it's going to help deepen your understanding of the gospel. A motif is simply defined as a distinctive feature or dominant idea in art or literary composition. So you're going to find motifs in all literature, just about. You'll find them in movies. Here's an example of a motif. Let's talk about foreshadowing. Now, Mark is going to use foreshadowing, but not exactly the way that we would define that. For instance, in the modern day, imagine you're watching a movie, maybe a thriller, murder mystery, and a woman is in the kitchen talking to another woman, and maybe she's preparing dinner, and they're just having a dialogue back and forth, and all of a sudden the camera cuts to one woman who has a knife who is chopping lettuce. And maybe the camera just stays there for 2 or 3 or 4 seconds, but it seems odd that they're not talking about lettuce, they're not talking about cooking even, they're talking about something else, but the camera introduces something there. Very likely that knife or maybe something in the kitchen is going to come into play later in the story. The other thing that goes with foreshadowing in terms of a motif for Mark is called retrospection. So let me show you what that's going to look like. Retrospection is looking back on an event, or maybe if you introduced an event, say in chapter 1, and then you revisit it in chapter 9. In foreshadowing, you may not know where Mark is going, but then in 9, you have one of those aha moments and say, oh, okay, now I see why he introduced it the way that he did. So let me show you the way that Mark tells his story. On the foreshadowing side, just in the first few chapters, he's going to elicit in his audience some very basic questions. For instance, he introduces Jesus as the Son of God, which would have been strange to non-Jewish ears, because the Caesars, like Tacitus or Augustus or Nero, any Caesar that ever lived, considered himself, and many of them in fact referred to themselves as Son of God or sons of God. So here is Mark introducing Jesus as the Son of God, and so many in his audience would have been going, really? He's not a Caesar? Who is this guy? Quickly in chapter 1, following the introduction of Jesus, we meet a guy named John who's baptizing people in the Jordan River out in the wilderness. And there's even a couple of strange things about what he eats. Then we have a voice from heaven. Now, this is living in the modern day, looking back, we go, oh, that's God's voice. But you have to understand, those who heard this first would have been saying, a voice from heaven? Really? That doesn't happen. So why would Mark introduce that at this particular point in the story? Then you got this person called Satan, who, quite frankly, many in Mark's audience might not even know who he is or who he was. And by the way, why is he tempting this guy called Jesus? What does good news really mean? I mean, if Jesus is going about preaching good news, what exactly does that mean? Oh, and by the way, he's got some kind of supernatural power because he can cast out demons and he can heal diseases. So each one of these small vignettes, these small themes, is introduced in chapter 1. I haven't gone anywhere past about verse 39 in chapter 1. What you're going to see as the story unfolds is that Mark is going to pick up these motifs down the road in his story. You're going to hear these same phrases, you're going to see these same ideas, these same principles, these same parts of the story, whatever, later on in the story. So he's gonna open the door for it in chapter 1, what we would call foreshadowing. And then, interestingly enough, when you look after he then reveals again or says again what he introduced in chapter 1, then that causes the reader to look back and say, oh, that makes more sense. I now understand why he did that. So here is what I want to tell you for this week and before we meet next Sunday. I hope that you're trying to read all the way through Mark. I hope that for those of you that were here a couple of weeks ago, you remember our discussion about how binge-worthy shows on Netflix just very easily can take up dozens and dozens and dozens of hours in our lives in a month. And all I'm really asking for is 2 hours, just maybe one day a week or 2 days a week, an hour each. Read as far through Mark as you can. If you can get all the way through, fantastic. But at least read chapter 1 again to look at some of those motifs, some of that foreshadowing that we introduced on that last slide, and at least all the way through chapter 2. I want you to begin to see where Mark is going to move the story. Hey, I love each one of you, and I will see you next Sunday night.